story. You've heard it a whole bunch of times. You know other details that we didn't read there. Maybe some of those details were new. But some people think that Noah, a lot of people think, some people maybe even here, think that Noah, the story, there was a real flood. 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, guy in a boat, animals, dove, rainbow, the whole bit. If the Bible said it, it's got to be true. All the evidence otherwise is just God's way of testing us, testing our faith. Maybe that's what it is. Some people believe that. Others think that's absurd, it's just a silly story, be done with it. And still others think, because it's a story, Noah is an allegorical story. It has a spiritual message, but obviously the water didn't cover the entire earth. Obviously, no one could have collected 2 of every species on a boat. Obviously, there's a message here, but not based on any real flood. What if it's a little of both? What if there is some historical background to the story that we've heard so often in our lives? And if so, might that help drive the message home, whatever the message might be? Some of you in this church really appreciate when I peel back the layers of the Bible and offer what scholars think about this or that, because it gives some new weight or depth to your faith. Some of you have what St. Augustine called faith-seeking understanding. Others of you prefer, I just stick with God's word. Peace and love, lift us up, don't get sidetracked by all that other stuff that archaeologists and anthropologists say. Personally, I like both ways of reading the Bible because the church has been doing that for the entirety of the church. So I'm going to offer that we're going to start with some, wow, that's really interesting, and end with, oh, I feel so inspired. That's the goal today. We try that sometimes, but that's the intentional goal today. So, you may know that Noah is not the only flood story in the world. Some of you know that in cultures from Asia to Native Americans, they all have flood stories because most cultures have floods, so they have stories about it. Our own town has a flood story, much smaller than this, but definitely dramatic. We still tell stories about it. We make plans based on what we learned in the flood. Can you imagine in decades what those stories might sound like as they evolve and shape? The Middle East particularly has a bunch of flood stories, and Noah seems to be the very newest one that was written down. Even though the Bible places it, if you're doing the math and chronology there, the Bible places it some 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. It was written probably about 2,600 years ago. How do you know that, Hansen? That sounds suspicious. Well, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and Hebrew didn't exist 6,000 years ago. It didn't really exist until much later. So the flood story, in fact, has words that are in Hebrew that didn't exist until much later than Hebrew was written. So if you can imagine like reading a story of Shakespeare where he talks about the internet, you would know, like, well, the internet was written back here, it might be about back then. So the Bible is telling us a story that was written up here about maybe back there. But Hansen, maybe the Hebrew story is based on stories from other languages. Exactly. That's the point right there. That's the point. You may have heard, for instance, of the Gilgamesh epic. Written 4,000 years ago. We can place it pretty well. It was set in Sumeria. That story, big long story, has a little bit of it about a flood, and it has a very different plot, different characters, different point, different gods, all that. But it has a flood, and it happens in the same area, which makes you wonder, was there one flood and people interpreted it in different ways? Maybe. Were there 2 floods and people had different ideas and maybe some stories got mixed up? Maybe that too. I know with fires in this area, there's all kinds of different fires, and some of those stories get mixed up, and I hear Jim say, no, hold on, was that the Black Tiger fire? Was that the one in 84? Was that the one? And so maybe the flood, same thing over thousands of years. But Gilgamesh is not the first flood story either. The oldest flood story in the Middle East, in fact, from some of the very oldest writing that we have at all, from almost 7,000 years ago or so, just little scraps. We only get little half sentences and we piece it together the best we can. Those of you who went to the Dead Sea Scrolls, you get the idea. Those scrolls were only 1,800 years old. This stuff is 7,000 years old, which, right about the same time as the Bible envisions the flood. Way back in these writings, in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, we all learned that in school, people had settled and they started farming. Before that, they had lived as hunters and gatherers. We all learned that in school. When you're a hunter and gatherer and your land floods, what do? You move. You're a nomad. You grab it and you move. But if you are the first kind of culture to settle in this area, when a flood happens, you can't pick up your house, you can't pick up your field, you just deal with it. So before they before when they were there and the floods happened, normal floods, they dealt with it somewhere else. When they lived there, they had to deal with it through living there. It seems like, with hints from geology and anthropology and literature, it seems like that many thousands of years ago, just as these folks were getting used to living in homes and having fields and having stable lives and healthy farms and all that, believing their gods were taking care of them, just then there was a massive flood, like one of these once in 10,000 year kind of floods. But it wasn't the annual one, and it was massive enough to wipe out the whole area that they had been settling for some time. And maybe in just about the most ancient language that any culture had ever created, someone started writing about this flood as advice for future generations if it happens again. And on those little scraps, like ancient post-it notes, it says, okay, next time, Guy, you go build a boat when the flood happens, and I want you to put grain on there, and I want you to get your family, and I want you to get all your animals. And here's the important part to today. What else do you think it tells you to bring on the boat?
Your family.
That one's in there. Kegs of beer. Yeah. The most ancient, really the second or third most ancient writing we have says bring kegs of beer on your boat when there's a big flood, which I think is kind of awesome. A big snowstorm happens in the south, and like people lose their mind and buy 12 bottles of wine. 7,000 years ago, the Proto-Sumerians just as smart. We're going to come back to that beer because I think that's a clue for us about Noah, but it's a little secret clue. Maybe those flood stories are related. I don't know. But there's another flood story, another possibility, also in the Middle East. Here's the idea. If you know anything about the history of the Earth, about 15,000 years ago, the ice ages were ending and the ice started melting. That lasted for about 8,000 years, so that means 7,000 years ago, again, there's that number, it keeps cropping up. About 7,000 years ago, the sea levels had been rising because all the ice melting, very simple, right? And all around the world, everywhere around the world, the shorelines from down here started rising up. Beaches just changed where they were, everywhere around the world. Inland, in what is now Turkey, there used to be a small lake that happened to be about 300 feet below what is now the sea level. And it was surrounded by higher land, kind of like a bowl, like a protected bowl. And just like the Dead Sea in Israel, this was full of salt, people lived around it. When the sea levels kept rising, eventually something about that bowl, that natural dam, broke, and the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, came rushing in, cataclysmic flooding, and created, anyone know what it created? The Black Sea. That big sea used to be a little bitty lake, way down low. And now the Black Sea is just about at zero elevation with the sea level. But back in the day, the sea was way down here. Big flood came rushing in. 25 years ago, they sent some submarines down there, and they found ancient villages 300 feet down on an ancient shoreline. This is just geology. You don't have to believe in God or Bible or floods or anything, but that's what's going on in the Black Sea. Could that have been the dramatic flood that led to these stories that eventually became the Bible's account? What mountain does Noah land on? Ararat. Anyone have an idea where Ararat is? It's right around the Black Sea, the tallest mountain you can see from the Black Sea, as though it is the most stable thing in their visions. 2,000 feet higher than Long's Peak. It's the most stable thing they could imagine in the midst of a massive flood. Interesting? Maybe there's a connection. Either way, historical story, allegorical story, maybe a little of both. If you try to imagine the degree of both of these floods, or even the Noah's flood, and really pay attention to that account, when we think about the people whose lives were destroyed 7,000 years ago, and the amount of suffering that happened, just take a moment and acknowledge, whether it's historical or allegorical, this is not a kid's story. These kids shouldn't really know about this story. This is really, like, it's not cute, furry animals. It's death. It's destruction that we can't even compare in our era. It's not a kid's story. It's also not really an adult story, because so many adults get stuck on this idea right in the beginning. And there's even more words to this than Kathleen read. They get stuck on this idea that God is punishing humankind. Adults get stuck on things a lot. Even if people die by the thousands, starting the story with God's involvement in that is a literary device to frame the story. It's not the point of the story. Movies do this all the time. Princess Bride. Is Princess Bride about just like a grandpa and a son? Well, yeah, but it's really about like the story, right? That's just a frame. Movies do it all the time. The Bible is doing it also. The frame is not that God is some moral loan shark out to take what he deserves. The frame is that God wants us to live better. People are disappointing God. God wants us to live better. We're moving from interesting to inspiration. So many adults especially the ones that are just sharp enough to think critically about faith, but not faithful enough to be critical of their own thinking. So many of us get stuck on the wrong point, and we do this all the time when it comes to religion. We get stuck on the wrong point when it comes to thinking about ourselves, our relationships, our politics. We humans are so prone to missing the point, and here we miss what the kids see right away. Kids read this story, they don't get stuck on God's punishing. The kids see that God promises to be there always. The kids focus on that rainbow. How always? How much always? Well, if you already think that God is in the business of saving the good and punishing the bad, which a lot of people think is the only business that God can be in, if that's the only story that you can tell yourself, then you probably do see Noah as confirmation of that story. You think Noah is good, God saves him. Everyone else is bad, they all die. That's the point, right? No. Because good old Noah, so worthy that God had him make a boat, save his family, the only one worth saving. He is so good. You know what happens after the waters recede? Comes out, builds an altar. You know what happens next, right after he builds that altar? He gets ripping drunk. These kegs might have been a hint about this. Here's the rest of the story that Kathleen didn't read. The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. Okay, so Canaan is Noah's grandson. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine, not beer, it is what it is, and became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. Okay, if you missed, just like to point this out. He's not just drunk, he's so drunk he passed out naked. Just want to point that out. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, told his brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth, the older two brothers, they took a garment, laid it on their shoulder, walked backwards, and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. I mean, how many times can you be clear? Like they're being very delicate with their father. Have you ever been really delicate with your father because you're scared of your father? When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son, Ham, had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan," grandson. "Lowest of slaves shall be he to his brothers." How did Canaan get the short end of the stick on this? Noah sounds not only like a blackout drunk, but an angry drunk who takes it out on his family. Ready for the point here? For all of Noah's supposed good qualities, he is an angry drunk who takes it out on his family, and God is still with him. God's still there, trying to help him live better. God is not in the business of measuring and judging us. We are in the business of measuring and judging each other. But God is in the business of being with us. When we trust that we have a holy purpose that we're called to, when we feel like we're better than our neighbors, even when we work hard to care for our family and save the world, God is in the business of being with us when we're lost and adrift, when we're searching for some stability, and when we slow down and give thanks. God is in the business of being with us when we make these awful mistakes and hurt the people we love, especially when we atone for that and try to do better. God is in the business of being with us at every step of our lives, and therefore every step of our lives offers a chance to grow deeper and deeper with God. Every aspect of our life offers us a chance to grow closer to what we're capable of being, to grow more faithful and spiritual, whether it's crisis or opportunity, anxious or patience, in grief or ecstasy, in piety or weakness, in enlightenment or missing the point. There is with us a spirit of healing grace. There is with us a spirit of truth pointing us to how to heal the world. God is with us in everything, always, from the flood to the rainbow. Now, when we fail to recognize that, as we will do, most of us try to compartmentalize our spiritual lives. And that feels good. We get that warm fuzzy from God. We have our God box over here for maybe this hour of the week. And then we have a box for our family, for our morals, for our food, for our sex, for our politics, for our money, for all those other things. And we try to let all those other boxes make us happy, which they do until they don't. But what if we shifted from this model of compartmentalizing our lives and we took down those walls? What if we gave up this idea of putting walls around this idea of God as though God is just real and a part of the world, or just some metaphor or force when we need it, or just for the good people, or just for this part of my life? And what if instead we started trusting a mercy ever present in the awareness of simply being? And what if that led us to recognize that everything is spiritual? Everything is infused with a spirit of grace and truth. Everything is open to the deeper values of faith, hope, and love. And it's up to us to relate, to connect, to grow, whether we are called to serve all of humankind or just to apologize for being a jerk to our family. God is with us. That's the point. And when we trust that we are not running from an angry God, not desperate to live up to impossible standards, but when we trust that we are supported by the very foundation of hope that gives this world its shape and direction, then may we have the freedom to live every moment moving closer to the beauty that we are capable of